community in our state. But today, we're going to turn our attention to an organization that is trying to help the family as well as raise some support and awareness. So joining us today is Miss Katie. She is the CEO and president of Help for HD. So welcome, Katie.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you and to keep sort of spreading that awareness about Huntington's disease when you hear that maybe, there's an estimated 30,000 Americans who have Huntington's disease or maybe are at risk for it. That's a staggering number. So first, I always like to start with a little brief description of Huntington's disease. So, Katie, how would you normally jump in and describe it?
So I'm going to apologize because I'm actually in Disneyland, California right now. So if you hear any background noise, I'm so sorry.
No big deal. We're just jealous.
No, no one's here. It's very interesting. It's almost spooky. But Huntington's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, and it is terminal. And so it is genetic. So each person who's born to someone with Huntington's disease has a 50% chance of inheriting their parents' same fate. As of right now, there is no treatments or therapies for Huntington's disease that help slow the progression. There are some treatments for the symptoms of Huntington's disease, but as of right now, if you get diagnosed, there's really nothing anyone can do for you. They experience movement called chorea, which is an involuntary movement, psychiatric behaviors, depression, anxiety, and then they also have cognitive impairment. So it's kind of a lot for families, as you can imagine, not only having to deal with these very horrible, life-changing symptoms, but also knowing that your children have a 50% chance of going through the same thing. So.
And Katie, on the website for Help for Huntington's, I saw a word that I'd never heard before, and that was juvenile Huntington's. So I think when, even those of us who feel like maybe we are getting more educated around the disease of Huntington's, you think of it more as a middle-age diagnosis, or the symptoms sort of come on, I guess, in like your 30s or maybe even your 40s or later on. But what is juvenile Huntington's? Because that really sounds like a bad diagnosis.
Sure. Yeah. So juvenile, the pediatric form of Huntington's disease is horrendous. And I remember learning about, my husband passed away 2 years ago from Huntington's disease, and he had a very high CAG. And so the higher the CAG, typically earlier the onset of disease. And I remember reading and Googling and finding there was a pediatric form. And knowing my husband had a very high CAG, I was terrified for my 3 children that were now at risk. So juvenile Huntington's disease is if you start symptoms before the age of 21 and your CAG is over a count of 60. So as you can imagine, Huntington's disease is often referred to as the worst disease known to mankind. And to see a young child have Huntington's disease is just it's horrible, and they're incredibly underserved, and these families have to navigate all on their own. There's no real true expert care for juvenile Huntington's. Of course, we have expert, amazing doctors for Huntington's that take on juvenile and pediatric cases and try their very best and do an amazing job, but it's incredibly underserved, and we find the experts in juvenile Huntington's are truly the parents living it. And they are the best at navigating and helping each other through the process because they are really the only experts out there in juvenile Huntington's disease besides the University of Iowa. We have one place, but
well, Katie,
very underserved.
I'm sorry to hear about your husband's loss to Huntington's disease, but I know that it's a tight-knit community once you get into it of Huntington's disease and family members and families who are going through it. So I know that it's there are those out there that completely understand, but had you heard of Huntington's before your husband's diagnosis? Had you ever been aware that maybe, this was in his genes, or was it a total shock for your family?
It was a total shock for our family. My husband was estranged from his biological father, and he hadn't seen his father since he was 6 years old. So we actually found out from a call from a mortuary saying that he was next to kin, and he had to sign papers for his biological father, to be cremated. And that's when we found out he died from something called Huntington's disease. And so it was a shock. And no, I had never heard of Huntington's disease before. I think in the salon I work at when I used to do hair before I did nonprofit work, I heard a family member actually say the word Huntington's disease. And interesting, when my husband was diagnosed, I found that the client that used to come in the salon, and I said, oh my gosh, my husband was just diagnosed with, I think, something your husband may have. And she ended up being the president of the HDSA organization in California, Northern California. So she was a huge connection for me. But besides that, no, I had never heard of it before.
Is that one of the reasons why you hit the ground running in terms of advocacy, or getting out there and trying to raise awareness with Help for HD?
Yes, absolutely. And it kind of gave me a little bit of power in a powerless situation. I knew my husband was going to pass away. I knew he was going to live have to endure a horrible way to pass away. And I thought what I could do with him side by side is fight for him and also for our children. So I started, Help for HD International was founded in 2010. But I didn't start working and I didn't take over leadership until 2017.
So what's the overall mission for Help for HD, which is Huntington disease? May is the awareness month for it, because I feel like, there needs to be more conversation around it. Is it more people finding out whether it's in their bloodline or just getting the word out for more research? Or, it feels like, on all the different levels, but like what's kind of that main mission for the awareness piece?
Yeah, so our mission at Help for HD International is education. So our mission statement is to educate the world about Huntington's disease, because you're absolutely right. Without people understanding and knowing the disease, we're going to have a really hard time finding researchers looking into the disease and becoming interested in looking for therapies and treatments for Huntington's disease, as well as clinical care. So it is true that we have to have a better awareness. We are a rare disease. We are considered rare disease, although we haven't had a prevalence study in so long. There is thought to be 250,000 Americans at risk for Huntington's disease. So that's a big number, and we definitely need more awareness out there so we can further research. But also, I think the big thing is an understanding, because people with Huntington's disease appear to be intoxicated or drunk. A lot of times they're targeted by law enforcement. A lot of times they are targeted by the general population. My husband was actually a sheriff. He was a police officer. And we were asked when he was at kind of mid-stage disease, no longer working, when we were on a cruise, we were asked to go back to our room because he was an embarrassment because he was drunk in public. And my husband didn't drink. And this was in front of our 3 children. My kids' soccer game, we looked across and parents were mimicking his involuntary movement in front of my children, thinking my husband was drunk. And so the lack of awareness by the general public and the lack of empathy is very hard on families. So the more we can get out there and let Huntington's disease be known, the more that we will hopefully get more of a empathy from the general public and an understanding that they are not on drugs and they are not intoxicated, and everything that happens to them is involuntary.
Well, I think
beyond their control.
Yeah, and I think that also just hopefully raises the awareness here on Good Things Today for families to have those conversations with their kids. It makes me sad to think that adults would sort of play into making fun of anyone, even if a parent did show up to the sidelines, intoxicated, then they too are hurting with an illness that they obviously can't control if they choose to do that at their child's, on the sidelines of their child's game. To have that conversation that, you never know what's going on necessarily behind closed doors, and that, we should be more kind and caring to sort of figure it out and see how we can help. And I know you're also helping just those families who are still living with someone with Huntington's disease. You mentioned your husband, and it feels like everyone I know, it's the husband. So I'm curious if females can get Huntington's disease, and I've got a few more questions for you. Can you stick with us, Katie? I hate to take your time away from Mickey, but can you hang on?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we got a little bit more with Katie with Help for HD coming up next for a little more. We're exploring more about Huntington's disease. May is Huntington Disease Awareness Month, and joining us on the line still is Miss Katie. She is the CEO president of Help for HD, and she lost her husband to the disease and is now set to just help educate and advocate for those still suffering with the disease, or I guess in future families as well. So I left talking about the fact that usually when you hear about those that suffer with Huntington's disease, Katie, you usually hear about men or husbands. Can females get the disease too?
Yes, absolutely. I always say Huntington's does not discriminate. We have families with every race living with Huntington's. It's not sexist. Male or female can get it. And of course, as we talked about, children can get it. I know one child that started having seizures from Huntington's at 18 months old. And I know a man that died in his late 80s. So, yes, women absolutely can get it.
How prevalent is maybe the testing for it when you first get those signs or symptoms, which I think many would say starts with maybe like Parkinson's, with the tremors or maybe the dropping of the things or just having those involuntary movements, as you mentioned, that can be perceived as being intoxicated, but not. Do physicians know to jump in and sort of ask those questions about Huntington disease, or does sometimes it take too long before they nail down what's going on with a family member?
Yeah, so typically it's interesting. The testing is a big deal. Obviously, getting tested for Huntington's, and majority, if you just go to your your regular care general practice doctor, they won't experience. They probably have never experienced someone coming in with Huntington's. As you guys said in the beginning, you guys have a great center of excellence there, which is awesome. They're kind of hard to find sometimes, so it's great you guys have one in your area. And there is a lot of genetic counseling that goes into the testing process, which is really good to get you prepared to get a diagnosis like Huntington's disease. But a lot of times there is a family history, so they've thought about getting tested their whole life. If there is no family history of something, yes, it is obviously harder for these families to go through the process of testing. But yeah, typically a doctor wouldn't look at it right away and say, oh, it's Huntington's disease if they have no family history of their knowledge. There is a family history. They just don't know about it. Then they would probably get misdiagnosed for quite a while.
Well, that was going to be my next question is usually if there is a family history, you would think that someone close to you, whether it's your mother or a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt, may have had, had the disease. But can it go generations without flaring up? I know we may be getting into the weeds of where maybe that's not your expertise, Katie. I completely understand, so you can divert us if needed. But, I think these are just a lot of the questions that when you start to raise awareness about Huntington's disease and the fact that it is a pretty gnarly one to get, people start to have concerns and questions about the safety of, their own family.
Sure, of course. Yeah, no, family, it does not skip generations. So if your parent has Huntington's disease, you have a 50% chance. If they do not, you do not. So, we do have a high adoption rate in Huntington's because Huntington's does bring emotional, physical, and, of course, financial devastation to families. So we do have a pretty high rate of adoption. And children getting taken away by social services and ending up in the system. So there's that, maybe why you wouldn't know about a family history. There's also been misdiagnosis of Parkinson's disease when really it wasn't Parkinson's. Ever since 1993, now that we have the genetic test and the blood test, it's easier to diagnose Huntington's, obviously, with a blood draw, where before it was a little bit harder. So,
well, we're talking a lot too about the families because this isn't just a singular, disease. You have one person with the diagnosis of Huntington's, but yet, it takes the whole village of the family to help care for that individual as they move through the stages of the disease. Nathan and Heather Thurgood is family members here at SuperTalk, but also big advocates in Mississippi for awareness around Huntington's. Nathan would be the one in their family that suffers from the disease. They were recently on your Help for HD TV, I guess you would call it, on your YouTube channel, where you just sort of bring in families and connect them and just, shared experiences and talk about, helping each other. How much is it support needed for just the caregiver themselves in the realm of Huntington's?
Yeah, the caregiver burden is such a huge, huge thing, right? Any disease, when you're a caregiver, it's hard, but Huntington's is a very long, it's a very long journey, and these caregivers, what they give up and what they do for their loved ones. And their loved ones are, we've always had this, their loved ones feel like they're a burden. They're never a burden. We love them, and we would do this a million times over again. But it is a 24-hour job. And Heather is an amazing advocate. She supports families actually all over the nation. If you watch her on like social media platforms and stuff, she is a huge support for families. So of course we had her and Nathan on the show. But yeah, I think caregiver support is really, really needed, and respite. And so we really talk about that on Help for HD TV and our radio show about how important it is to take care of yourself. Well, we know that that's really hard to do, but it is truly important, because without a caregiver, where will the patient and the loved one be? Because they 100% depend on the caregiver.
Oh, absolutely. And watching your episode with Nathan and Heather, which I linked it to our SuperTalk Facebook page, if someone listening would like to go and just maybe hear from a family what it's like, because it can feel very, hopeless as those of us who maybe don't have people in our family are connected to the disease, on how to help maybe friends who are struggling with that, because it's a completely different animal once you start sort of learning that it's down to just the tools needed to eat or to just do about in your daily activities, to the different things that just sort of start to slowly go away and transition in terms of how the person dealing with it does their daily activities, as I mentioned. So how can we, listening to Good Things, Katie, help support families who do have someone with Huntington's disease? Because, again, it feels very hopeless. In how do you help?
Yeah, so I think the website has an amazing, it has so many resources on it. So if anyone's listening to this and they are an HD family, please come to our website, and we have so many services we offer, and we would love to get to know you and see if we can help in any way as far as resources or anything you need. For the families that aren't affected by HD, I think that knowledge is just so powerful in the world we live in, and just to understand what people are going through. I love what you said about, the person that may have been intoxicated at the soccer game. You just don't know, and to look at the world through different eyes, I think, is so important. And so getting to know about Huntington's disease and learning about it, and then that way, if you see someone and they're having a hard time, maybe now they have HD, and you just smile, because a smile says a million words opposed to a stare and a shake of head, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It also takes the burden off the caregiver.
And I was going to say, too, if you know someone who is caring for a loved one with HD, maybe they're in your work circle or your church circle, and, now you've heard this awareness piece here on Good Things, offer to bring them a meal, or to ask her if you can run an errand, or, just think of ways that maybe you can help lighten the load, or take one more task off, or just let them know that, that you are there if they need a break or whatever that necessarily may be. Because just listening to Heather's story, and she shared it openly with you on your Help for HD TV. I mean, she's a caregiver for Nathan. She works full time for SuperTalk, actually, and she's a mom, and she also has an ailing mother. And so you just want to give her a big hug when you hear about what's going on behind someone's smile. Even if they show up at the office and do their job well, you never know what someone may be juggling, again, behind the closed doors. And so just having a little bit more compassion, I think, is probably always a good thing too.
Yes, I agree. And and I think the one thing I could say about the Huntington's disease community and the caregivers are they are the most resilient people walking this planet. And I think you see that in Heather, what she deals with, and she comes to work, like you said, and she smiles and she keeps plugging on like we all do. We're resilient because we have no other choice but to be, for our loved ones and for our children. But yes, you are so correct that just sometimes bringing over, a caregiver typically is not going to ask for anything because they are so strong and they are so resilient. And sometimes just showing up with that lasagna or with that lawnmower and say, I'm going to mow that front lawn for you, is like, it just is amazing how much stress that takes off.
Amen to that. I can totally agree. And those are the small things that I think we can all do to help pay the help in the relieving of some of the load that those caregivers and their families have to do. I don't want to take you away from your Mickey experience any longer. I know you and your family are probably super excited to get there and have a fun day. So I totally appreciate your time here on Good Things, though. Where can we go again to get all the information for Help for HD?
Yeah, please go. It's www.helpforhd.org. And like I said, there's tons of resources. And thank you so much for taking the time and learning about Huntington's and juvenile Huntington's today. And May is HD Awareness Month, so if you know any families, reach out, and we'll all try to do the best we can to bring more awareness to this horrible disease.
Well, if you see Tinkerbell, give her a wave for me. She's my favorite.
I will. Thank you so much for having me.
All righty, you guys stick with us. We've got more for you.